Thank you, everyone, for being here. It is always a highlight to get the Inspire HR community together. Again, my name is Jamie Klein. I'm the CEO and founder of Inspire HR, and we had over 300 people register for today's session. And we are catching people at a time where I know folks are just a tad Zoom fatigued. So the fact that people are so passionate about this topic really says so much about our program. We've been doing this program for about a year. And for those who might not be familiar with Inspire, and we have lots of new folks joining, we were founded 14 years ago. We are a firm that advises to CEOs and CHROs on every topic that is on their human capital agenda. We typically help them with all those things keeping them up at night, and we help in three ways: either providing interim talent, helping with strategy and assessment, or doing training and coaching to upskill and help employees and leaders really get us through what is today's modern organization. We very much hope, most importantly, that your loved ones have fared well during this pandemic, and we are so thrilled that we are together as a community again today. So with that, thrilled to introduce our fantastic panelists. We are at a moment where 78% of talent professionals say that diversity is the number one thing impacting their hiring today. And not only do companies with greater diversity, especially in leadership roles, see higher profits to the tune of 20%, but diverse companies who really make this commitment are seeing that 2/3 of job seekers are attracted to them. Why? Because a diverse leadership team and workforce is the most attractive thing, especially to our coveted Gen Z and millennial talent. So with that, I am thrilled to launch this dialogue. We are in great hands for this conversation with our panelists: Rachel Morris, head of Human Resources at TED; Anthony Lewis, the who does recruiting operations management at Beacon Talent, who we're huge fans of; and our own Inspire expert, Tiffany Daiba, who is our specialist in the area of recruitment. So with that, welcome to the three of you. And I want to really kick it off with just to really set the table. I'd love to hear from each of you where your organization is on their journey around DEIB. And we use DEIB as in diversity, inclusion, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. I know there's a lot of acronyms going on, but you'll hear us say DEIB a lot. So Rachel, I just would love to get a sense of where things are with TED.
Thank you so much, Jamie, and it's great to be here with all of you. So TED's diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging journey is really, I think, inclusive of all of those important words, if you will. And it's really ongoing and an org-wide journey with staff at all levels playing a role. So we've partnered with an incredible team of scientists and researchers at Stanford, actually, called SPARQ, and that's SPARQ. And they've really challenged us to approach this work like scientists. So rather than expecting that we have all the answers, we've brought some very necessary humility to this work, focused on just asking really important questions with one goal, and that's to reduce bias and increase inclusion in everything that we do. So our work right now is organized into two do tanks. The first is an internal do tank evaluating everything from internal policies to promotions and recruitment. And the second is an external do tank focused on aspects of our work. So definitely an ongoing journey for us at TED.
I love it. And I love how you've woven that into the whole employee experience, from the onboarding to the advancement, etc. Tiffany, over to you. I know you're in and out of so many companies as a consultant.
Yes. Thank you again for having me, Jamie. One company that comes to mind that I've been really impressed with is a project that I'm on currently. And they have a pretty robust DEI council that meets monthly. And one thing that I was really impressed with just joining these monthly meetings is that their focus on DEI sort of spans past recruitment and the sort of hiring journey. And I think sometimes in the beginning, what we've seen is companies just kind of focusing on that in the HR and recruitment space. And what I've seen is different players from the associate to executive level, part of this DEI council, to focus on how to bring in a more inclusive workforce throughout different facets of the organization. So I'm really excited to see where that continues to go, specifically with this org.
And that's so key, is bringing together the masses, right? So people from diverse experiences, but also that diversity of level, right? Really making sure that all voices are heard. Anthony, again, you see so many organizations. I'd love to get your perspective.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Jamie. For us, it's really about what are the operational definitions of what you called out. Now, I think recognizing that DEIB is not just a catchphrase. They each have their own distinct and unique meaning. And for us, one thing we called out very early is that, individuals can't be diverse. Teams and communities are. And so, for us, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging isn't just a project with an end date. It's something that we're really trying to continue weaving into the fabric of everything we do. And so to Tiffany's point, myself working across a spectrum of clients, we use outcomes-based hiring and try to help our clients to reinforce that predominantly within their hiring process, because that's the scope of work we do. And so how can we help companies reduce bias, think objectively? And I love the way that Rachel pointed out, use research to make decisions.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Because I think that the board level, the C-suite, they are so used to calling on data to make decisions about marketing, technology. Let's bring that into the diversity conversation, and what gets measured gets done. Yes. So I'd love to hear a bit, what are the main reasons that we are seeing that companies are prioritizing DEIB in hiring? I know this is a moment where there's a overdue racial reckoning in our country. That comes top of mind to me, but I very much would love wisdom from you. Anthony, let's kick that off with your perspective.
Absolutely. That's a great question. For me, a lot of the companies we work with are in that growth stage, startup land, right? And so I think especially since a lot of I like the way you put it, social reckoning that's been going on, this community in particular in the tech world has been historically homogenous, right? And so quite frankly, a lot of it is pressure from the social ether. And a lot of companies on the other end, while they haven't advertised it, have been at this for a long, long time. But I think it is really, to your point, the business case. The statistics you threw out really resonated with me. A lot of companies, in doing their research on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, realize it leads to greater business success and product success. It leads to broader market penetration because you are literally casting a wider net, not only just as it relates to your recruiting and hiring efforts, but as far as the folks that, the customers and clients that you advertise to and work with, and even the suppliers and vendors that you partner with. And it's just greater productivity. People who feel like they have a sense of safety and can bring their true selves to work every single day are more productive. Their go provide just greater output for the business. So there is a human case, but there is a very clear business case. And we see a lot of our clients starting to wake up to that as well.
Absolutely. And you're speaking my language. I always say that starting, creating that business case for DEIB is so key. Again, what gets measured gets done. But if we're just talking about the business case, we're a touch stuck in the 80s, because that is a term that was coined in the late 80s. And to be modern, it's really about the human case for DEIB. And it's truly a moral imperative. And everyone in the Inspire community and the folks that we all have a small role to play in that. I always say if I grew up and I was an actuary or an opera singer, I couldn't really move the needle at all at this moment in time. But all of us who are leaders of companies and HR visionaries can very much impact that social change. Tiffany, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, thank you. And absolutely agree with everything Anthony said. I read a statistic recently, and I believe it was from McKinsey, around this kind of post-millennial generation being the most kind of diverse workforce kind of out there. And so, ultimately, in my mind, it's really about, changing with the times and really sort of catching up to where we sort of should have been all along, and really speaking to this new generation. The human piece, of course, is a big part of it. And something else that I think of in terms of productivity is also the creativity side. And so I think, thus kind of bringing in a more diverse workforce is really sort of increasing that kind of creativity and innovation, and really bringing new perspectives into the business as well.
Absolutely. And what do they always say? It's like, by nature, sometimes we want to surround ourselves with people that remind us of our fabulous self. And we get no creative ideas when that is the makeup of the people around a decision-making group. But that the lack of groupthink, I think, happens more when you have those differences around the table. So I'd love to talk a bit about how we assess talent, right? The qualifications for a candidate, and any advice for talent managers who've historically like trusted direct experience, but recognize that if we just rely on direct prior experience, we might be limited with our candidate pool because of some of the structures that have been in place that very much created gates. And are there any other qualifications that are just as indicative of success? Rachel, I'd love to start with you.
Sure, Jamie. So I really appreciate this question because one thing that's really important to just be mindful of is when you're leaning in on direct experience, it is by POC talent that are generally underrepresented, right? So whether that be in key business roles, whether we're talking about the C-suite level or just senior management in general. So hiring managers looking to fill positions where their entire list of minimum requirements includes this sort of, whether it be niche experience or senior level expertise, or even requirements that people have carried lofty job titles. That kind of direct experience ultimately is going to reduce your talent pool, often at the expense of BIPOC talent. So, I always find it interesting that there's so much emphasis on direct experience, but we rarely stop to think about who is actually being afforded that type of direct experience. It's not typically people who look like me. So one of my big requests with working with hiring managers and even outside recruiters is not only to consider what aspects of a role can actually be learned on the job, but to also encourage, kind of looking for talent in more creative ways. It's sort of moving away from this kind of box check approach to recruitment. And frankly, I can even use myself as an example. When I came on board at TED a little over 3 years ago, I had no media experience, I had no tech experience, and I had never worked in nonprofit. And I'm sure there were some who thought that having a background in media or nonprofit or conferences was a necessity for the role. But I had a unique background. I was an HR leader in the design world, having spent 16 years in architecture. But architecture, to the point Tiffany was making, is an incredibly collaborative profession from a discipline perspective, and it's also highly innovative. So there was a creative connection that may not have been so obvious at first. But luckily, the executive leadership group at TED was able to see the value in my whole background rather than focusing on the fact that I didn't check the media experience box. And it's interesting, this question sort of reminds me of a TED Talk, as many things do. And it's Regina Hartley's talk on why the best hire might not have the best resume. She talks about hiring scrappers, those who may not have gone to Ivy League schools or have overly impressive resumes, but because they faced, whether it's hardship or adversity, even learning disabilities, these are individuals who can be incredible contributors to any business. So again, it reinforces that there's a lot of value in a less linear approach to assessing qualifications. Understanding a candidate's whole story might actually add value to the work that you're doing.
I love it. And I remember when Ted, a longtime client of ours, was actually looking for the one, and it was clear that you were a gift from the moment that you started.
Thank you, Jamie.
No, it's true. And it's interesting because I think that there, when you were saying the part before about the underrepresentation, you're speaking my language, these systemic barriers have been in place. So if you want to find key talent, it's about looking for the core competencies that people have underneath some of those more veneer things that pop for us on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is like, it's like it feels a little bit like Facebook, but like for work. So like, let's get real about what's kind of underneath. I want to get a little bit more technical. What are some of the kind of do's or don'ts in writing inclusive job descriptions and attracting candidates? We get this request so much from clients, especially in the last year. Tiffany, I'd love to start with you.
Yeah. So I have about a list of 20, but for the essence of time, I'll just give my 2 to 3. So I think number one, I think there's an aspect of gender inclusive language. I think that that's something that is easily fixable on a job description and can be a huge miss. So what do I mean by that? Sometimes you'll see on job descriptions more gender coded terms like rock star or nurturing or things that are competitive or terms that can be associated with a certain gender. And I think it's really important to kind of keep things as neutral as possible. Also, too, sometimes you'll see on job descriptions a he, she instead of a you or they. And I think really being respectful of pronouns and how someone identifies is really important. So I think that that's kind of number one. Number two, I think it's another big miss on job descriptions is having that laundry list of requirements, right? And I think this sort of piggybacks off of what Rachel was saying is specifically women and specifically, marginalized communities, they tend to apply for roles that they're 100% qualified for. And so there's a big pool of talent that we're missing out on because we have these 15, 20 bullets of, very technical, requirements that we may be missing out on great talent, like Rachel at TED. Thankfully, TED got her, but we should be focusing more on performance objectives in our job descriptions and less on the tactical. So I think that's number two. And I think lastly, it can also be, calling out more inclusive benefits, things like paternity leave or parental leave. Instead of saying maternity leave or paternity leave, saying things like parental leave and being more inclusive in that language and really speaking to some of the benefits that would, engage, more of a diverse community, I think would be another thing to speak about as well.
All great points. And I know people are going to reach out afterwards for the other 17 that you didn't mention, but I so appreciate those. And that is, I think, such an important key, because so many clients come to us and they say, Jamie, I actually don't even know where to start. Like, I want to do the right thing. I'm awake. I'm realizing that this is such an overdue need. And the JD, the job description, is kind of like ground zero. It's kind of where they want to start. So all these points are great. Let's get to the next step. So I want to kind of think a little bit about the life cycle, right? So we're thinking about the JD. I'd love to talk a little bit about sourcing diverse candidate pools and including people who collectively represent a wide range of lived experience. And boy, I think we are living in times where lived experience is so needed around the decision-making table. So I'd love some hacks, some tips for all of our talent acquisition folks here who want to expand their reach, but are having trouble finding those diverse candidates. So Anthony, over to you on that one. I know you are a treasure trove of ideas when it comes to this.
Yeah, I'll try not to make you look bad, Jamie. But for us, it's a lot of what we do, and we see this problem every day. Because in fact, I think a lot of folks do start with a job description. We actually recommend people start with a scorecard. And so the difference is a job description is just a piece of advertising for the job. A scorecard is an objective, typically internal document that you use to align the organization's goals to the department's goals. And then finally, what are the individual outcomes that this person needs to achieve and on what timeline. And what we're seeing for the organizations and partners who do a really good job at this is that they try to bulk sourcing into different personas. And we define a persona as, to Jamie's point, someone with specific lived experiences, potentially technical skill set, and also behavioral competencies, which I think for folks who want to open up the aperture a bit is indexing towards a lot of those behavioral competencies that you don't see on paper. And so once you start to identify what are the different personas that we can, reference versus like if I'm hiring, someone, out of the, the VC community, and I'm requiring them to have, private equity experience at a top tier PE firm. Well, what realistically speaking, there is a literal total addressable market of folks in that space, and they may not look like the folks that you want to hire. And so maybe what are the other personas, i.e. skill sets and behaviors that translate into that role, right? And so I think, even internally, if you're not sourcing externally, look internally and say, where can I reskill and upskill people, right? If you have customer success people, maybe they could become your recruiters. Maybe your recruiters could become your product people, right? I think the most successful organizations not only cast a very wide net by using a scorecard to tie goals, outcomes to organizational goals, they also do a really good job internally to upskill and reskill people because they're thinking very objectively and quite frankly, creatively about the role as well.
I love that, the upskilling. Love that. Tiffany, anything that you want to add there?
Yeah, I think, from a tactical sort of sourcing perspective or kind of inbound application perspective, something that I've talked a lot with different HR leaders about is this idea of making or creating an opportunity for these opportunities to be visible to these communities rather than the opposite, which could be viewed as tokenizing. And so that's something I've talked to a lot of leaders about, because often, you know, as a recruiter, I'll get a vacancy that I'll be tasked to work on. And a lot of times it will be like, well, we would love if, you know, we had, you know, a Black woman on the slate, or, you know, whatever it may be. And I think that that approach can be viewed as tokenizing, because then what happens to a recruiter is we have to go out and then sort of seek that person out, versus making these opportunities a little bit more visible to these communities. So a way in which I've really been empowering hiring managers to do this is through Slack channels. So it's something that's been a little bit of an untapped resource, but there's a lot of really great Slack channels out there that really welcome job postings and just an opportunity to talk about different organizations. So I can provide a list for the chat if people want to know later, but just things like Ladies Get Paid, or Out in Tech, or Techie Era, you know, Natives in Tech, Black in Tech. There's so many great channels out there to where you feel like you're kind of pulling these folks in rather than sort of picking them out and sort of checking the box.
I love it. Women in tech came to mind too. And I think we all, even pre-pandemic, where I think it's even more needed, I think as humans, we're really just craving community. We talked about this a lot in last month's panel about how the mind is wired and how we all have bias. We're born with it. If you're human, then you have it. So it's just really about being aware of that bias, but very much communities want to very much come together. It feels like a safe space. So finding those various communities, so that out in tech, women in tech, and kind of very much finding folks that way. And my biggest hope is that, you know, it's like always create a diverse candidate pool. And then from like that mass of amazing people, then like you find the best talent, right? And so it's about doing it that way. So I love to launch our second poll. Again, we're always so excited to get everyone's feedback. And we'd love to hear how your hiring managers, maybe some of them are you, if you're given the sufficient tools and training to reduce those personal biases. I'd love to see how folks are feeling about that. So we'll give you a moment to give us your feedback, because this is an area that I know so many organizations are struggling with. Again, it's all right, I've woken up, I'm aware, I want to do this. Where do I begin? I've created the JD. I've thought a little bit about the do's and the don'ts of how to assess talent, but like, how do I even then get my leaders ready to do the right thing, to have that more modern lens when they go ahead and they look at this candidate pool. And we're seeing that, the majority, 69% of people say that they provide some tools, but need a touch more training. So you are in good company. You are in good company. So with that, and I just want to call out, like, everyone also, before this became a higher business priority, also had a day job. Like, people's lists were really long. And the thought that, especially in the last year where there's been this racial reckoning that's so overdue in our country, while we've been stuck in our homes and we've really had to sit so still and really sit with it and sit in the discomfort. What I'm hearing so much from our clients is that the list was long, right? Leaders are dealing with, I don't know, like this thing called return to work, or return, I don't like to call it return to work because we've been working, return to office, the mental health crisis. Like, there are just so many things that leaders are dealing with. And now to become an expert at having more of a diverse lens on recruiting feels like a lot. So I think any type of education around that can just kind of quickly upskill our leaders and get them ready to really do this imperative that needs to be. So, okay, I'd love to talk about this whole concept of search for sameness. Again, we explored it a lot back in April, but it's a major barrier for diverse hiring. And I'd love to explore some ways that, you know, talent folks can interview and mitigate their own implicit bias during the search. So yeah, Rachel, if we could begin with your insights there.
Absolutely, Jamie. I'm happy to talk a little bit about that. Really quick to the context of the poll regarding training and so forth, which is really important in terms of developing leaders, creating a space to have kind of honest conversations around race for staff. One thing I wanted to just share that's a little bit more of a sustained learning and development approach is that we have an L&D initiative called TED at Work. We've designed a program for organizations interested in a curated collection of TED Talks around a number of different topics to include hiring and diversity, equity, and inclusion. But it's a program that offers a learning framework on each talk with tools that support everything from manager-led to peer-to-peer and small group discussions. And we use it internally as well because there's so many great ideas coming from our TED speakers. So I just wanted to shout that out in the event anyone's interested in learning more about TED at Work. I'm happy to pass more information on after the session. And again, what I'm highlighting there is the more sustained learning and development rather than the training that can sometimes feel one-off and have a short-term impact. In terms of the learning piece.
Yes, yes to anything coming from TED. Just teach us, yes.
Thank you, Jamie. So to your question, yes, the search for sameness, yes, which can be a barrier to hiring diverse talent, and then how we mitigate bias during a search. I think the first step here is just recognizing that we're biased, as you just said, Jamie, all of us. It's shaped by our backgrounds, our upbringings, personal experience, is what we're exposed to in the media. And so we bring bias into our work and into our decision making. So I think a recognition or just kind of sitting with that, I think is a really important first step. I created something for myself many years ago that I like to call my own intrapersonal checks and balances. And that's been valuable for me in every aspect of my work because as I prepare to make a decision about a candidate, for example, I try to call myself into a space of self-awareness just to be sure that the decisions I'm making are, they're rooted or grounded in something objective and merit-based. So I think that self-awareness of the presence of bias is really important. Obviously, other ways to mitigate bias during a search, many organizations are using a blind kind of resume process since there's a lot of research that shows that candidates with ethnic sounding names are historically less likely to receive callbacks. And I'm talking about for roles that they're actually qualified for. Mm-hmm. So there are tools and software. I'm aware of Blendor and Pinpoint. There's a lot of options out there that kind of highlight relevant skills and hide kind of identifying information. But on the other side of that, I also think it's important because there are times when you don't want to be blind and instead you want to be quite intentional to ensure your shortlist for a job opening has representation. So again, there's value in blind resume processing coupled with some intentionality to ensure that the shortlist coming out of a blind resume process is in fact inclusive. Let me offer another thing that's really important as well around engaging diverse candidates in a search. And that's really through building your own cultural competence. So there's an assessment that's been around for many years, and I'm sure there are people on this call that have heard of it before. It's very widely used in corporate settings, nonprofits, and also in education. And I've found it to be particularly valuable because it's a tool called the IDI, which means Intercultural Development Inventory. And I introduced it at TED because it's a tool that measures cultural competence, which by definition is the ability to interact effectively across cultural differences. And so the way that it works is you take an assessment, it's just a 50-item questionnaire, it takes about 20 minutes to take, and it actually gives you two things in the context of results. It gives you what we call a PO, which is a perceived orientation, which is really about how you see yourself engaging across cultural differences and similarities. But then it also gives you your DO, which is your developmental orientation, which is really actually more reflective of how people are actually experiencing you engaging across cultural differences. It's just for all the assessments out there, there's never a shortage of questions about the effectiveness of assessments, but I personally think the IDI is a pretty interesting tool that just allows some introspection and greater self-awareness around how you might be engaging in the presence of diversity. Finally, I just also add that, one thing that is not lost on me that the most commonly used term I hear oftentimes in recruitment is fit, which is often synonymous with sameness to the point of this question. So everybody is always looking for the right fit when they are recruiting. So at TED, I encourage hiring managers to define fit as something we don't already have. Like what can the individual add, whether it's to the work or to the team or to the culture or to the rounding of skill sets that isn't already there? Because I think that's the stuff that really pushes creativity and innovation. So I'd encourage defining fit as something you don't already have, because that can be valuable in disrupting that tendency to recruit for sameness.
I love this. Culture ad is what we often call it. So when we talk about candidates, will they be a culture ad?
Absolutely.
Yeah, yes. And yes to everything you said. Okay, so we're going to continue through our hiring process. So when we think about the journey from offer, from JD to offer and all the steps in between, I'd love to think about some quick wins, some things that people can do to boost their employer brand. We have a guy on our team who's a transgender male, and he's created this beautiful program with us around how to create a culture of inclusion for transgender colleagues. And he speaks about how, like, when you go into the lobby of a company for your interview, if you don't see a gender neutral bathroom at like your first interview, it's just kind of a signal that this place just might not be home, right? Like, and this of course is all pre-pandemic, but just like these small things that we look for as humans, whether it's, scouring the company's website to look for, look at what their leadership team is. I think that people very much want to look several levels up and see someone that reminds them of themselves, however they define themselves, to feel like they can feel comfortable in that organization. So a lot of it is about employer brand. So I'd love to hear from folks on things that we can all take away to boost that employer brand. Tiffany, if we could start with you.
Sure. So one thing that comes to mind that I've seen organizations do more, specifically an organization I'm working with currently, is partnering with local organizations working with marginalized communities. I think is a really great way to kind of promote that employer brand and kind of I think that there's ways that you can talk about that on a blog or social media. If we think about quick wins, even just really adding some of this content to the content calendar to really sort of promote that, because what do people do now, right? They immediately go, at least I know something that I've kind of taken away from this last year is the minute that I want to purchase something, or I'm thinking about working with a brand, I go to their social media and I see what am I seeing? What kind of content am I taking in? And I think that that's just such a quick win to really be able to kind of talk about that. Something that's also amazing is Slack posts. Like, they're very transparent. I don't know if anyone's been to the Slack kind of company website, but they're very transparent in the way that they post about, the diversity that inside their organization, who works there, some of the strides they've made. They have a whole page dedicated to that on their website. And I think that transparency also allows for it to not look performative, but also to look like it's a work in progress, because I think that's another takeaway that's happened over the past year is you saw the little black square after George Floyd's murder, and then you've seen nothing. And so how is it that we're going to kind of keep the momentum going? And I like to see that level of transparency. And I think that that's really something that can be done quick and easy, but then it also garners credibility within the organization.
Such a good point. June is Pride Month, and I'm always so energized when I see, everyone's company brand is a rainbow, and I love it. But sometimes I'll look at brands during October, like when it is not Pride Month, and I think, what are they up to now, right? Like, how are they being allies at this point? So I think you raised a really good point. There was a lot of energy around racial inequity last summer. We've been at diversity for 14 years at Inspire. It seems like a lifetime ago, but in the fall of 2017, when Matt Lauer was exited from the Today Show, like, that was another moment in time where there was such a focus on gender equity, right? And you saw, I feel like on LinkedIn, every woman I'd ever met was like suddenly promoted to a role. And I was like, these fabulous women, they've worked here for years, but suddenly, like, they all were getting, up leveled. And I think that it's really about the consistency and not having this hashtag moment, but really having a movement. And candidates are savvy consumers, right? They're kind of shopping for their home. So I think all the things that you mentioned around the content is really important. Anthony, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, definitely. I really like the way Tiffany called out, one season, a logo will be in season, and next season it's not. What I'm realizing is that we're at a place where you're not just speaking to a brand, people want to show themselves. And so companies who can empower their employees to advertise their personal brand versus, I'm a big box company and here's my logo, right? That's the direction we're headed in. And so I would highly empower, from, sourcing to all the way making an offer. How can you get your people and their unique lived experiences in front of the process? Not, you as company advertising to individual, but individuals, really communicating with other individuals. I want to tie it back to a question we started with, is why a lot of companies are doing this. And I think at this time, consistency is so important. There's a lot of companies who are prioritizing DEI and B for, what can I do as an organization, but also challenge your entire industry. I really respect the work that the folks at Black VC are doing, folks like Frederick Gross, who are, creating a lot more diversity in the leadership ranks in the venture capital community, and they're pushing other people to do it. And so I think when we're at a place where like, this is what I'm doing as an organization, that's great, sure. But if you want continuous improvement over the long haul, over the next 100 years, you create a community within your industry and get other organizations and people to follow.
That's it. And one of our clients in the LA area is very much in the entertainment space. And we were so taken by their leadership team when we got to know them in Q4, and they talked about wanting to very much move the needle in their organization, but then be industry leaders where they can truly change who we see in front of the camera when we consume movies and TV shows. And how do you get there? By also thinking about who's behind the camera. I don't know what a key grip is. It's always in the credits, like, who's your key grip? Who's in the camera team? Like, who is your casting team? Who is looking for talent? Who's your admins? Like, who is the team behind that camera? And that's going to impact the team in front of the camera. And then that's where the 100 years of change ahead of us, I think, really begins. But the idea of this client being so committed to being an industry leader is so energizing for our whole team.
Jamie, I just will just kind of add, it's so exciting to hear that, kind of across industries, because the one thing we've learned working with Stanford Spark is that bias really moves and hides. So you solve for it in one place and then it shows up in another place. So it's just a reminder when you hear people doing this wonderful work, that this work is cyclical, like it is ongoing and will never be done. So don't look for an end date, because there isn't one.
Thank you. And it is a lifetime work in progress. There's a guy in our team who worked at the CIA for 30 years. He was so funny. When I got to know him last summer, I said, could I see like a sample of your work? We just want to get a sense. He's like, literally everything was confidential. But for 8 of the years there at the CIA, he literally led diversity. And he said that there were initiatives that were very in vogue in the 80s that kind of sunsetted, that then came back up in the 90s. And like, he'd been there for enough cycles to see the start, mid, and end date. And he was on our panel back in July, and he spoke extensively about, like, when you've been at this work for a long time, you see that cycle. And I love that there is no end date. We are all a work in progress. So speaking about being a work in progress, a piece for, we always try to look at Inspire through the entire employee experience, right? From, recruiting, which we're going very deep on today, to onboarding, advancement, retention, who gets picked for the reorg, all the way through to the elegant exit. But an important piece of that journey for me is total rewards. And this is such a pain point or a passion point of mine, that research shows that Black women on average are paid 63 cents on the dollar compared to white men. And I'd love any innovative ideas from y'all on how we can best combat the pay inequity during the hiring process. So yeah, Rachel, if we can start with you.
Sure. Well, this is obviously a really important question, because the pay gap is essentially widening the overall wealth gap, right? And so there's a couple of things that that are kind of top of mind for me. So we know it's appropriate to ask about a candidate's salary expectations during the hiring process. That's completely lawful to do, right? What we cannot do and what is unlawful in many states, is inquire about salary history. And I do believe wholeheartedly that laws banning salary history have been a huge step in the direction of pay equity. But I do like to push on this a little bit further because we have to be mindful of the potential to also create disparity when we allow a candidate's salary expectations to be the starting place or the baseline for a salary discussion. Allowing someone to share their salary expectation first can create inequity because there are applicants from certain groups, such as Black women, who are more likely to have experienced bias or discrimination in compensation discussions. So what I may be conditioned to even think about my own worth as a candidate and consequently inclined to ask for as a salary expectation may be dramatically less than that of another candidate who has the exact same experience that I do. We also know that applicants from certain groups, and particularly men, are more likely to negotiate on their own behalf. So while it's totally appropriate and lawful, again, to inquire about salary expectations, rather than allowing the candidate to share their expectations first, offer every candidate perspective around what the position's going to pay, even if it's a range. Because if you don't have it already listing in your job postings, which is fine, not everybody does, be sure to address this early in the interview process. Because to move closer to pay equity during the hiring process, I really think we have to remove the onus from the candidate to set the table high enough for themselves. Instead, offer perspective as employers around what the position will pay up front. And again, I can use myself as an example in this situation too. I've lived this. I can remember the very first time I decided to just be silent and allow the hiring manager to tell me what the position would pay before I offered any salary expectation. That was a huge turning point for me because I would have asked for significantly less than what was being offered for that role. But again, that is largely shaped by my own experience navigating compensation as a woman of color. And I want to make one other point here, Jamie, around combating pay inequity. And that's just to emphasize the importance of allyship. You know, I always encourage women in BIPOC talent to be able to tell your own story, be able to talk about what you've accomplished, how you've contributed, how you left a place or a project or a thing or a profession or whatever it is better than you found it. Like, be able to tell that story for yourself. But what's also really important as well is allyship, particularly from those in privileged positions of power who have the ability to help tell your story in ways that can propel you forward. You know, those in these powerful positions have to tell the stories of BIPOC talent as well, because they're not typically out front, but they are doing amazing work or helping to push the culture of your organization, only they're doing it behind the scenes or in the background. So I just really believe allyship is really important. And beyond just telling their stories, we have to recognize them, we have to advance them, and we have to pay them. It's necessary if we're really going to address opportunity gaps and pay inequity.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh. So yes to everything that you said, and research that I've read consistently shows that when women are earning for their family, a disproportionate amount is spent for females on education for their children. The tutor, the whatever brings their kid joy and helps their kid reach their potential. And that is, I think, part of this kind of cycle that we find ourselves in. We have about 15 minutes and about 73 questions that people would like answers to. So I'm going to go to our Q&A section, and lots of people send in questions even before today's panel. So we'll move through these as quickly as we can. And for those who have additional questions, feel free to add them to the chat, and our moderators are doing their best to get them all in. So from the top, how do you think homogeny comes, I probably just pronounced that word wrong, comes from a lot of hiring just from the group of people you are currently physically around them, and that they just don't live or work in diverse communities and hire, promote from within? So how do you think that comes from a lot of hiring? Any thoughts on that?
I mean, it sounds like a question of networks, right? I mean, people are kind of living, existing, playing, working in an insular bubble, right? With homogenous, whether it's friends, where they're fellowshipping, where they're going for coffee, all of these things. And so that's why it's so important to kind of broaden, kind of your own scope, your own relationships, et cetera, and then lean into, I think in the context of recruiting or hiring, I mean, it's important in organizations to lean into kind of the diverse talent in the org as well. Kind of, we have a Black at TED ERG full of incredibly talented, inspiring humans. We want them to be kind of socializing open opportunities at TED as well. And so a lot of times that question is really about kind of networks and the kind of homogeneity in terms of how we live and work and play.
Absolutely. Tiffany, Anthony, any additional thoughts from you before we go to the next one?
Well, I was just going to say too, around, I think that like goes into referral programs and how they can kind of, be counterproductive right now. To Rachel's point, I think that the network you keep is probably who you'd be referring. And so we have to be really careful as talent organizations when we think about referral programs and the type of individuals we're bringing in, because that has the opportunity to backfire and thus not bring in more of a diverse workforce. So how do we revamp those programs to really be more inclusive? And there are ways to do that. But I think that absolutely.
That's an excellent point. And some of the company referral programs are quite generous. It's like, like go to Home Goods and like refresh your whole living room kind of budget. I think of things always in how much budget you can get at Home Goods, but like, yes, like a serious amount. And so then you're just going to reach out to whoever your group of friends are that you're having to kind of like trip on, because they're always around you. Next, love the emphasis of focusing on transferable skills. How would you recommend balancing this for those more technical roles where the hiring manager is adamant on candidates having the direct experience, i.e. design or marketing? Anyone want to take that one?
Yeah, I'll definitely, because I think this is a good thread. And I always want to say that I always offer my consultation, happy to chat with anyone in the audience offline, because you can never get these done in one workshop or one seminar, right? But in my response here, the TLDR is you got to get more buy-in. I, as a talent practitioner, have spent my career moving away from being a salesperson, because that's what you are effectively as a recruiter, to a consultant to the business. And so the first thing I would challenge you, is try to understand what role you play to the organization and that stakeholder. And then, continue to build consensus through credibility, right? So how well do you understand the organization's goals, product goals, the business model, what that stakeholder hiring manager wants to achieve? If you don't have that, it's not even playing field. And so I would say get buy-in through that credibility, and from there you can start to intelligently, push back and say, well, I know what this role needs to get done by Q2. We don't need this, right? And so if you want to hire for this is going to take 90 days, not 120 days. So you can either miss your deadline, or we can, short circuit the search, and we're right back where we are left off. So,
I'll add to that as well, Anthony. I just think I tend to question that every single line item of direct experience is actually critical or necessary. And so I would really encourage, and this is for folks on the other side of the table that are actually leading these recruitment efforts, be mindful. Yes, there may be some technical skills that are absolutely necessary for literally day one when you walk in the door, but what about the opportunity to kind of skill up and give people the opportunity to learn on the job? I think that's something we need to be talking more about.
And then when they get there, give them that ally, that coach, that sponsor, because the last thing we want to do is bring talent in and have them fail. I was speaking to a CEO of a recruiting firm, and she said, Jamie, historically, we have a 1-year guarantee on all talent that we place. She said, for our diversity leads, our VPs of diversity, they're being brought in now. I'm wondering if we need to shorten that 1 year, because I think so many of them are being brought in this flurry because organizations are trying to focus on it, but are they really set up for success? Do they feel that sense of belonging when they get there? So that stuck with me. We have just 10 minutes left, so I'm going to keep on going. What are tech tools? So I hear so much about every talent professional relies on tech in some way during recruitment. Are there any tech tools that can either help or hinder diversity in hiring? Anthony, do you want to kick that one off?
Yeah, I'd love to. I can be very candid to say I haven't used a wide array of technologies outside of your typical applicant tracking system. We actually use a makeshift Airtable view to manage a lot of our candidates, manage the pipeline, manage data, store data across clients. But it may be gimmicky, but our greatest tool is our scorecard, quite frankly, because I kind of compare leaning on the technology to reduce bias, basically trying to treat every problem like a hammer and nail, right? Sometimes it's not that. Sometimes it is literally your process, right? And so for us, our greatest mechanism when we push back on clients is we're very intentional about the recruiting process. We measure it like we would a product, performance.
Mhm.
And so if we see a trend line of bias, and that was a great point earlier from Rachel, we all have them. But the best way to combat it is through data. And so if something's not in the scorecard, we discount that piece of feedback from the hiring manager. We record and store every single piece of feedback throughout the process. And if it hits day 30, day 60, day 90, and we're wondering what's going on, we have data and we can say, hey, for the last 20 people you disqualified, this has been the trend line, right? And so I think your greatest tool is not technology, but it's your process.
Mm-hmm. Next question. Again, I could say so much about all of yours, but I want to make sure we cover that. Regarding the employer brand, is it tokenizing to display your diverse staff? Any thoughts on that?
I'll jump in really quick, and then, or Rachel, do you want to take this one? I saw you.
Go for it, Anthony. I'll kind of chime in after you.
Cool. I'll lay it up after. But big basketball fan. But for me, I don't think it's tokenizing. I think it's about intent again, right? And I think in that specific scenario, it's hard to measure. But if you look back at consistency, I think that was a great point around consistency. If you're just praising, your BIPOC, talent, your underrepresented talent, because that's what it is. I think diversity is an accepted term, but I think I like to call it what it is. It is underrepresented and historically marginalized talent.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so I think if you look at, the trend line again and say, am I only, throwing them on the website when it's convenient, or if I'm throwing them on the marketing material, the college brochure when it's convenient, but internally they're not getting promoted. They don't feel safe or feel like they could bring themselves to work. More importantly, if there's a high degree of turnover, right, of these folks, then there's a discrepancy. If you got a bunch of people on your brochure that look like XYZ, but it doesn't look like that internally, and I've experienced this pre-COVID, right? That's where the problem is. And so I don't think it's tokenizing. They should be able to tell their story, but at the same time, there should be consistency.
And it should match the whole employee experience when people are in the door. Rachel, yeah, thoughts from you?
No, I think you're right, Jamie, and I love what Anthony just said. It's really about, you want to live this. You want to be, walking the walk rather than just talking the talk.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like when I think about what we've learned from Stanford Spark, diversity, they say, is a fact, right? We know that we're diverse, right? But the E piece for me is really about equitable outcomes. And that has everything to do with, kind of the process associated with recruitment to the employee experience internally, whether it's tied to promotions, opportunity access, and that kind of thing. The I piece, inclusion, is really an actual practice. And we've learned that from Stanford Spark as well. And so that's where this work comes into play. If you really want to live this, it's got to be manifested throughout kind of the DNA of your organization. We talk a lot about the fact that our executive director at TED, he is the chief diversity officer. He has to be as bought in and as committed as I am and every other employee across the organization. So I love what Anthony shared. And I think this is really important.
Absolutely. Thought on this, we've talked so much about gender equity, racial equity. How do we combat ageism and overlooked tenured applicants who are frequently labeled as the O word, overqualified? And Tiffany, I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. One of our experts on our team is a multi-generational workforce expert, and I always learn whenever she presents, just around this is, we have 4 generations all at work together, and you do have this trend where many times more tenured candidates are told that they're overqualified. Any thoughts on how to combat that, Tiffany, if you think through different things that we've experienced?
Yeah, the one thing I was thinking about actually, and I was thinking about ageism earlier, can go back to the job description as well, because when I was thinking about some of the things that I shared earlier about that, language in your job description can actually be I think counterproductive to a more seasoned professional if you say things like fast-moving environment, fast-paced environment. How often do we see must thrive in a fast-paced environment? And I think that can actually be discriminatory to a more seasoned population. So I think if we're trying to combat that, I think that there is work to be done in the job description and the way that we talk about these opportunities. That's one thought I have. I would actually really love to hear what the rest of the group thinks about this, because this is a tricky one, and I would love to learn from both of you too on this.
Yeah. We're all learning together on these. Yeah.
No, I agree. I was thinking about talking about some of the software programs that kind of remove like identifying information. We talked about ethnic sounding names and so forth, but also even graduation dates, kind of tied to education and so forth. Yeah, we have to be super thoughtful and mindful of kind of the experience that, because generational diversity is obviously really important as well. And it's one of the things that I appreciate about kind of taking the IDI, because it's measuring your cultural competence in terms of your ability to engage across cultural differences. And it's not limited to race. It's the generational component as well. It could be socioeconomic status, it could be all of those things. And so I think you're right, Tiffany. And I'd love to hear kind of any kind of suggestions from Anthony as well. But if you want an inclusive work environment, it means generational diversity is a top priority as well.
Absolutely. And it all goes back to the business case, right? You need, if you think about the product or service that you're trying to sell, it's many products and services can very much attract a customer. And Anthony, it's not that I don't want to hear your brilliance. I just want to make sure that we touch on the next question, which is, how do you define underrepresented groups? And I'm going to ask for a real quick answer because then we need to wrap. But how do you define underrepresented groups?
Yeah, and I'll start this one off. It's through learning, right? Cultural learning. I think, and just to call out, I'm looking at the question now. Underrepresented and marginalized, excuse me, versus depressed. It's about building a cultural understanding of what certain groups have experienced throughout. I think corporate history, right? For example, I did some learning myself and realized that in corporate America, the idea of human resources was started administratively to support CEOs and serve as a bridge between folks in factories and on the front line, getting equal pay so they don't get sued, right? And so I think when you just understand certain dynamics of the workforce, you'll understand how some of that bleeds into who we're pushing away versus who we're welcoming. I think for the whole, the case around ageism, for example, a lot of folks will put, 2 to 5 years, 5 to 10 years, and have a bias against, well, this person is a bit older or more seasoned, and it probably wouldn't be able to, fit into our culture, et cetera, right? But I think, again, if you think about, well, there's a lot of skills and behaviors that they bring to the table based on that experience. It's not about fitting in, it's about, I love the way you put it, adding culture. And so I think just continuous learning and understanding how certain mechanisms have marginalized these communities is a great place to start.
Yep. And continuous learning is the note that I very much want to finish on, because we are all lifelong learners at this. Tiffany, Rachel, Anthony, thank you so much. I have learned so much here today, and I know that folks, from what I'm seeing in the chat, have as well. We are marking this moment and just saying thank you. I'm so glad that we are here. It is in the Northeast. It's getting a touch warmer. I think that there's a lot to look forward to. So please mark your calendars. June 9th, our next session is on inclusive leadership and the role of the C-suite in advancing DEIB. We'll have leaders from Johnson & Johnson and the head of HR from New York Times. Look forward to seeing you then. Keep Inspire on speed dial if we can help with anything that's keeping you up at night. Stay healthy, and we'll see you soon. Be well. Bye.